Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Democratization. The Anglo-Saxon conquest. Might makes rights. Liberalism or death. This was the choice offered to the Axis powers in the Allied demand for unconditional surrender. If the Germans are to be accused of inherently fascist tendencies, or of accepting the principle that might makes right, what could better verify this thesis than the acceptance of conquest by the Allies? To conclude that the Nazis were wrong only because they were defeated militarily makes sense only if one accepts the Nazi-fascist principle that might makes right. Isn't this the fascist way of moral equality? The greatest verification of the fascist worldview is that democracies were willing to defeat Nazis and fascists, not through the supposedly democratic means and methods of persuasion, but through the fascist way of superior military, physical force. Doesn't pragmatism, when stripped of its conventions, mean the ends justify the means? This was principle with which the West won its victory over the Nazis. Pragmatic fascism. Fascist practice was destroyed by the fascist principle of superior physical force. The victory of liberalism in practice was the defeat of liberalism in principle. Fascism was confirmed in principle by its defeat in practice. For fascism's ideological opponent to demonstrate the superiority of superior military force over reason or nonviolent persuasion almost makes a greater case for the fascist view than if the fascist regimes themselves achieved victory this way. The defeat of fascism in practice was the victory of fascism in principle. The philosophy of pragmatism ensures that, in extenuating circumstances, one can violate every normative liberal principle because the deepest liberal principle is self-preservation. Pacifism would be the consequence of valuing liberal social principle over the hypocrisy of pragmatic fascism. Conversely, it is moral hypocrisy for the pragmatic fascists of the West to not use force to keep their own population down or for men to not use force to keep women down. There is a moral double standard in the legitimization of the use of force for others, while neglecting its use against one's own population. Just as the West presumably advocates the same standard of human rights for all people, consistency would demand a common standard of human wrongs. If civilization was defeated in principle, perhaps this means that the first principles of fascists are more in line with first principles of nature. Perhaps the right of conquest is a kind of natural right. At the very heart of the Norman way was this paradox of conquest civilization. The superlative Norman identification with civilization was inextricably balanced and bound with a superlative identification with conquest. This was a root of the paradox that defeated Nazi Germany. This is a secret of the success of the imperialism of English-speaking world, the political inheritance of Norman aristocracy. Imperialism was the source of much of the West's pretensions to universalism. The triumph of Lincoln the Conqueror and the Anglo-Saxon democratic revolution was not a total revolt against the Norman inheritance, but the implementation of a peculiar form of political equality, an Anglo-Saxon conquest of the Norman conquest. The superficial name-calling game between the barbarian and the civilized traces its modern genealogy to the barbarism-civilization paradox imposed by the Norman conquest. The Norman conquest was the hypocrisy in principle that catalyzed so much of the West's political success in practice. From this came the common destructions of the harrying of the North and the bombing of Dresden. Barbarism in the name of civilization. Chapter break. Neither completeness nor consistency. Politician and priest Friedrich Naumann may have promoted the German liberal view more effectively than anyone in the period before 1914.1204. Yet this liberal, founder of the National Social Party in 1896, was proud to contrast German honesty about colonial brutality with the British liberal hypocrisy that attempted to dress imperialism in a humanist garb. 1205. While Naumann presented the contradiction of domestic liberalism and imperialistic illiberalism, The British tended to draw the borders between us and them less sharply. Their style of contradiction stemmed from the more humanist admission that the colonized are us, or human, too. How can one explain these persistent differences between English and German attitudes? The conquest made England a colony of Normandy. As the conquerors engulfed all of Britain, the ensuing empire retained a lingering ambiguity between the colonized and colonizer, between the conquerors and the conquered. Since the practical unity of empire required some concessions of freedom for the conquered and colonized within Britain, hypocrisy of this variety became virtually an imperial British characteristic. This ambiguity would eventually be exploited by men such as Gandhi. To behave in accordance with liberal principles without political hypocrisy would be to reject imperialism. The Anglo-Saxons, in rejecting unity with the conquest order, were led towards the logic of egalitarian consistency. The Germans, in accepting self-unity with the political, were led towards the logic of completeness or the total autonomy of the political whole. Anglo-Saxon liberalism assumes political incompleteness in the specific sense that the political level is assumed to be outside and objective rather than internal and subjective. German cultural totalitarianism assumes political completeness in the specific sense that the political is assumed to be integrated with, and in some sense, a culmination of one's identity as a whole. While the former is represented by Locke's idea of a contract with government, the latter is represented by Fichte's ideal, absolute ego. The Anglo-Saxons were politically incomplete without an account of the Norman-based order after 1066. This political incompleteness is the root of Anglo-Saxon political anti-totalitarianism. They could ultimately achieve wholeness only by excluding a socio-biological interpretation in favor of a reinterpretation as individuals. Individualism led to a logic of egalitarian consistency. False assumptions of the socio-biological completeness or wholeness of the conquest order were thus countered with the modern premise of the individual. While the Englishman Thomas Hobbes formally launched the modern political logic of the mass individualism, German Carl Schmitz reconstituted the logic of political completeness. While Anglo-Saxon alienation from the political promoted an objective attitude towards politics, German holism totalitarianism was made possible by a self-incorporated Weltanschauung that opposed a strict separation between subject and object. Newtonian physicalism is correlated with a radicalization of this Anglo-Saxon combination of a relatively consistent physical objectivity and a lack of self-incorporation. On a practical level, greater physical consistency among Anglo-Saxons is correlated with the view of their polity as an economic machine, while the German uber-organismic view entailed more overt contradictions between subjective and objective views of reality. While the unity of German identity with political holism seemed to entail an acceptance of large-scale paradoxes or self-contradictions, the equality of individuals can be considered superior in consistency of liberal principle only through neglect of scales above and below it. Liberal individualism, in other words, is not ultimately more consistent than the uber-organism view of politics. Bourgeois inconsistencies are glossed over under the banner of freedom. One is free to end analysis with the individual self. Government is an object for analysis. The individual has rights. On closer examination, however, liberal individualism is inconsistent on the level of multicellular holism, individual cells, just as the social uber-organism is inconsistent on the level of individual human beings. The breakdown of holism in favor of egalitarian consistency leads to the breakdown of the holism of the individual human being towards consistency with the larger physical world. Consistent physicalism would mean literal consistency with physics without any exceptions for human subjectivities, i.e. the subjectivities requisite for eating. In the West, egalitarian consistency takes precedence at the expense of completeness. German social uber-organismic completeness takes precedence at the expense of egalitarian consistency. Their incompatibility is not accidental. The Anglo-Saxons evolved a strong preference for democratic or egalitarian consistency precisely because this principle could be used as an enlightened weapon to destroy the uber-organismic model that had become corrupted by the Norman conquest. The practical expression of the liberal principle of consistency between individuals is that one should not harm others or deny their freedom so that others will not do the same to you. The Norman conquest shattered anything resembling this liberal principle of political equity precisely because William the Conqueror and his followers were willing to risk their lives and fortunes in an un-Hobbesian bid to do unto others what they would not want done to themselves. This is how the Norman conquest introduced a foundational inconsistency or double standard between the conquerors and the conquered that modern egalitarianism attempted to undo. Chapter break. Lebensraum. Within we protest against the whole Norman power, proclaimed a leveller's declaration of 1649. All the people of this nation are yet slaves, being under the laws and government of William 1206 instead of a Trolulch's sentiment of honor and participating in the whole. Levellers and many other anti-royalist agonists in the English Civil War conceived of the entire government as a whole separate from the people. The laws and government of William were perceived to be a whole unto itself. These protesters were not necessarily dissident individuals, but collectively they represented the dissident nation. Individualism, in this case, was only the realization of collective liberty. Was this Trolulch's conception of collective liberty surviving through adaptation to the Norman yoke? The whole Norman power meant that the government was Normanity while the folk was humanity. The nation was us and the government was them. They exploit us, they demand duties from us. They are not of us. This tribalistic us and them attitude towards government betrays a form of holistic thinking in itself, a holistic sense of the other in the whole Norman power. This anti-political reductionism is thus dependent on an underlying holism. The German sense of continuity with the political identified the whole of a territorial state with us and other political bodies as them. This led to the notion of Lebensraum and the legitimation of aggressive expansion into new territories. The Anglo-Saxon sense of discontinuity with political identified the conquered nation with us, or humanity, and the government with them, or Normanity. This is an origin of the liberal universalistic belief that there are two kinds of people in the world, the universalists who do not divide the world into us and them, us, and those who do them. There is something, not only tribalistic, but also profoundly territorial, about the Anglo-Saxon struggle for political freedom. Instead of conquering territory in the horizontal dimension of homes and adjacent lands, territory was conquered in the vertical dimension, like the highest floors of the same home. Instead of a Nazi German demand for external Lebensraum, the Anglo-Saxons demanded nearly endless internal Lebensraum. To conquer the conquest there had to be an internal colonization of the political, the conquest of the political in the name of freedom for internal Lebensraum. Landmarks of freedom of speech were like Anglo-Saxon flags stabbed into what was once the conqueror's propagandist jurisdiction. It was the Saxon Siegfried slaying the political tentacles of the Norman dragon. A hunter's pride in subduing the lion-hearted was revealed as victories of freedom were celebrated and memorialized like stuffed heads of lions on the walls and carpets. The flip side of universalizing Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism, democracy, is the universalization of reversing the Norman conquest, overthrowing all non-democracies. The Anglo-Saxon way of empire is conquering the conquerors universally. It is the right of conquest of the conquest of rights. Human rights imperialism. If the Norman way was top-down, then the Anglo-Saxon way would be bottom-up, even if it would have to be imposed top-down. The frustrated ethnocentrism of a few once conquered West European peoples could world historical overcompensation conquer humanity. All Homo sapiens. The Anglo-Saxon conquest of democratization could expand this internal Lebensraum across the entire world. The Anglo-Saxon style conquest of internal living space meant that the German way of conquest of external living space had to be conquered. In other words, if the Anglo-Saxons could not be the master race that the Normans represented, then no one should. If Locke were right about the tabula rasa, it would imply the possibility of a new kind of empire. If the Normans represented a form of hereditary domination, the new nurturism implied the possibility of a form of cultural domination. The demand to cleanse hereditary government could be universalized to new territories across the world. If the Anglo-Saxons were destined for death as a hereditary body, then everyone else had to be brought down to their kin-selective graves as well. Prisoners who petitioned for liberation at the end of the English Civil War in 1651 believed the law was the badge of the Norman bondage. 1207 Compare this with the Hegelian notion that the state makes possible the actualization of freedom. In Hegel's identification of the state and a collective form of rational freedom, one can see the kernel of the more romantic Nazi notions of collective freedom. In the belief of those Anglo-Saxons who held that the law was the badge of the Norman bondage, one can see the divergence from the Germans. The state was permanently tainted with the stain of Norman slavery, whereas 17th-century moderates such as Sir Edward Coke thought that the common law was a genuine Anglo-Saxon inheritance. Many more radical factions believed the law itself was a part of the Norman oppression. Far from being a product of abstract reason, the Anglo-Saxon emphasis on freedom from government originated in revolt from Norman civilization. The conquest of Norman civilization over Anglo-Saxon culture did not completely destroy a more characteristically German romantic holism. Instead, the government itself became identified as a separate whole in conflict with the other whole. The people seeking freedom from the whole Norman power in superficially civilized calls for freedom or liberty. There is a remainder, however reduced, of Teutonic Romanticism. Anglo-Saxon freedom contains a Nazi-like desire for freedom from artificial restraints of unnatural law or civilization itself. Anglo-Saxon freedom shares with German collective romanticism a sense of the people as a romantic holistic body in conflict with artificial law or civilization. The thoughtless association of freedom with enlightened rationality does not quite capture how these notions often expressed a desire for freedom from rationality. From a Darwinian perspective, human civilization amounts to a human zoo. While the Nazi Germans attempted to escape the zoo of Western civilization, they were eventually forced back into the iron cage. The West decreed that the German, blonde beast should be as collectively undangerous, tame, and civilized as Anglo-Saxons had ultimately become under the Norman civilization. Anglo-Saxon freedom includes an unconscious, yet reduced, equivalent of German Romanticism, freedom from the laws of political civilization. The great irony is that the striving to realize the dynamics of the reduced Romanticism of Anglo-Saxon freedom ended up destroying its primal socio-biological origins. Only the Germans had preserved the primal, collective freedom of their ancient ancestors. After the turning point defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad, Martin Heidegger spoke explicitly about German destiny. In whatever way and however the external fate of the West occurs, the most significant and specific test for the Germans still lies ahead, that test in which they perhaps will be tested by the ignorant against their will, to determine if they, the Germans, are in agreement with the truth of being, if they are strong enough in their readiness for death against the small-mindedness of the modern world in order to rescue the originary in its unpretentiousness.